Hello, BookTube. We're continuing on with our read-along of Christopher Hitchens' best-selling book, God Is Not Great. I'm doing this read-along with David Murphy, and we're doing it chapter by chapter. We're reading a chapter every weekday until we run out of chapters, which is going to happen this week. We are going to finish this book this week, in which case it will have the definitive BookTube assessment on the record. And we're up today to chapter 17. And in chapter 17, Hitchens does one thing really well and one thing really poorly. And the whole chapter is built around one of the things that if you make a habit, which I don't advise, but if you make a habit of tilting against religious apologists, one of the first things you'll encounter is the objection that's raised in this chapter. The chapter is titled An Objection Anticipated, the last-ditch case against secularism. And if you deal with apologists, if you talk with them, if you listen to them, if you hear their arguments, one of the things you're going to hear them say, sure as shooting, is that objection. In fact, it's usually not last ditch. Usually they come across it pretty quickly. They use it right out of the gate. And that is to say, some variation of, you criticize religion for its bloodthirsty past, but look what secular, non-religious regimes have done even in the recent present. Look at the 20th century in which, for instance, secular regimes, non-atheistic regimes, have been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. Nazi Germany, Communist China, Communist Russia. These regimes that expelled religion and were even more brutal. As Hitchens points out, in this chapter, you wonder what what the second beat of that objection is. What is the second beat of that objection? Apologists never get to the second beat. They consider that they've laid down a mortal blow with the first beat. The second beat, though, is what? In order to... it's like the current plague of whataboutism in our political discourse. If you say, well, what about X, who also did all these horrible things? You are ceding the entire argument. You aren't starting there. You're ceding the whole point. The whole point being that all of those things are wrong, and that anyone who does them is wrong, and that therefore the person you're defending is wrong. You're ceding that point when you do any kind of whataboutism. And this is the ultimate case of that. And the religious apologists that I've heard use this thing, to me, never seem to get that. You're saying, yes, religion is guilty of a whole bunch of these horrible crimes, but look at these people who are even more guilty. That doesn't actually defend your position at all. But that is the gist of this chapter, is Hitchens anticipating that apologists will say that. And sure enough, when he was on the road in what he obnoxiously called his little book tour, he got this defense quite often from quite a few people, including from the con man Dennis Prager, whose name we've heard elsewhere in this long walkthrough of God Is Not Great, and he answered it in a way that I thought was absolutely infuriating. The infuriating part of this chapter, might as well get it out of the way first, is what David and I referred to as dirty pool early on in our reading of this book, and it is one of the largest examples of Hitchens playing dirty pool. Did it in this book, did it in all of his lectures, did it in all of his debates, so-called debates with religious opponents, and that is to make his own argument unfalsifiable, after having said in this book and in person many, many times that if you make an argument unfalsifiable, you are betraying its weaknesses, not its strength. The weakest argument is the one that has been crafted to be unfalsifiable. It should be possible in any argument, in any stated position, for you to say what revelation would disprove what you're saying. If you say nothing would, that there is no argument you could make to me that would prove my argument false, then your argument is elastic enough to be a delusion and doesn't warrant a discussion. And in this chapter, Hitchens reveals, he's hinted at it throughout the book, but he reveals in this chapter that he does the same thing himself, because he when confronted with this anticipated objection of all of the communist secular regimes, the explicitly atheistic regimes in, for instance, the 20th century, Hitchens' gambit is to say that they weren't atheist. To say, well, that doesn't really count. Well, that doesn't really count either. Well, that doesn't really count. If it has anything, if it has any characteristics that look similar on the surface to religion, well, then it was a religion. Then it was religious, and you're not. I'm still right. When in reality, when you look at those regimes that specifically forbade the worshiping of gods, specifically forbade religion, that are still killing millions of people, that are still barbaric, that are still repressive, what you come to is not, if you look at that honestly, what you come to is not the contention that religion poisons everything. Instead, what you come to is something much closer to what David said in one of his first videos, which is that religion pushes the edges. That religion is just a force multiplier. It is just a guise through which people can do what they're going to do anyway. The fact that you could have a massive society in which religion is removed and still have all of the iniquities that Hitchens has been writing about for 200 pages proves that. To me, it proves that fairly well. But that is the negative side of what you get in this chapter, is that each of those examples is hauled forth and then called religious. Stalin's Russia is called religious. Nazi Germany is called Christian. And so on and so forth, right down the line. And this is the case that new atheists have run with. They love, and anybody does. It's human nature to love arguing from what you feel is a non-falsifiable position. But it's false. It's deceitful, either of yourself or of others, to do that. This is Hitchens just having a free hand with history in a way that he knew better. He knew better than to do this, and it's on its foremost display in this chapter, where he's saying anything that looks secular, that behaved bad, I'm going to call religious. I'm going to argue was religious. But this chapter also contains the best, I think, the purest distillation of Christopher Hitchens' particular magic, his particular value as a public intellectual. The particular thing about him that we miss, that we don't have anymore. And that is that although he could be a blowhard and a bully, he hated totalitarianism. He hated the crushing of the human will. Absolutely hated it. And I'll admit, I would argue that in most really strong crusading cases like this, in Hitchens' case and everyone else's case who's ever made a prominent place for themselves by crusading against something, it comes from the personal first. Hitchens himself bridled at the idea of being co-opted, of his intellect being co-opted, of lockstep, of groupthink. He hated that idea right down to his DNA, which is what caused him to be a lifelong contrarian, and which is what caused him to get in bed with ideological stances that if he'd taken a mental step back, he absolutely would have condemned. Absolutely would have condemned the Iraq War, except that the consensus condemned the Iraq War. God knows what he'd be doing today, but I argue that personality trait, that inveterate genetic resistance to groupthink, that insistence on being contrarian, on getting in front of the public, on a soapbox in the public square and saying, well, you all say this, but what about this? Isn't that a refutation? Isn't this a valuable stance to think about? I think that's invaluable. And this chapter is animated entirely by that. Hitchens can go on about religion all he wants, but what he hates is totalitarianism. And that's what he argues against squarely in this chapter. This chapter is about totalitarianism. It's about subsuming the individual, not just in terms of coerced actions, taxes, observances, that sort of thing, but in terms of thoughts and feelings. You'll notice in the chapters that we've been talking about, he's at his most heated and animated when he's talking about that. When he's talking about inroads that religion makes into your personality. It was his besetting fear when he was diagnosed with cancer. His besetting fear was that it would unseat his reason. The thing that terrified him, his doctors would describe to him, okay, here's what you're going to go through. We caught this late. Two of his doctors were very explicit with him and saying, we caught this late. There is no real chance that you're going to survive this, but we'll do our best on the chance that it might happen. You have an extremely robust constitution, so we will try our best, and here is what you're going to go through as a result of us trying our best to save you. And it's pretty horrifying. I mean, these doctors laid it out for him as they have laid it out for quite a few people have heard a variation of that of those meetings. And that, let me tell you, those meetings are horrifying. They are absolutely horrifying. When you sit across a table from someone and you're concentrating on their Harvard tie clip, and they're describing to you the things that are going to happen to you as a result of them trying to save your life, the humiliations that you're going to go through, it's pretty horrifying. And Hitchens heard all that without batting an eye. The only thing he cared about in those meetings was, am I going to lose my mind? Am I going to be mentally enfeebled? That's that kind of absolute baseline chromosomal dislike of being co-opted internally is what bothered him about the whole procedure. And it stayed the thing that bothered him even to the end. In his very last interviews, that's what he was worried about. He was worried about not thinking clearly. Even when he was going through the humiliations that his doctors had laid out for him. Those humiliations are pretty bad. They are pretty bad. If you haven't been through it, you really don't have any idea what it's like to lose your physical sovereignty to that degree. It's pretty bad. And yet, the thing that most worried him was losing his mental capacities. When you're in the early stages of chemotherapy, you often have a fogginess in your mind. Your body is adjusting to this massive amounts of chemicals that are being introduced into you. And Hitchens asked more questions about chemo brain, so-called chemo brain, to his doctors than he asked about anything else. About the vomiting or the hair loss or anything like that. He was more curious about chemo brain than anything else. And a lot of his doctors told him something that is absolutely true, which is that you suffer less from chemo brain, the initial fuzziness of your brain when you're starting a heavy routine of chemotherapy. You suffer less from it in direct proportion to how much you have drank in your life, how much alcohol you've consumed in your life. If you go into chemo having been a heavy drinker, of course you can't drink when you do it. That's suicide. There are people who do, but you have to stop all of that. You have to achieve an ascetic lifestyle in order to do it. And if you go into that coming straight from a life in which you got drunk every weekend, in which you had a few drinks every night, maybe you got drunk every night, as Hitchens did, you're going to suffer less from chemo brain. Your body is already accustomed to overcoming fumes. And the doctors told him, you'll get it, but in your case it will probably be fairly short, and it was. But in this chapter, I think more purely than in any other chapter in this book, Hitchens grapples directly with his hatred of systems that go inside their victims. Bad enough if you're being given starvation wages in North Korea and being forced to, sing the praises of your dictator all day long, but for it to move inside, for you start to believe that your dictator is a god, that struck him as really worse, and it calls out some wonderful writing in this chapter. I want to read just one bit here. Let's see here. Where is it? Where did I go? Let's see. Oh no, okay, I didn't mark it, but it doesn't matter because it's the whole chapter. It's the whole chapter here is him talking about regimes that were so totalitarian that they affected your soul, that they got inside your soul. He mentions in this chapter, I believe it's in this chapter, the God that failed. Absolutely seminal text about totalitarianism, and every time he mentions that in person or in this book, I always think that is the better fate for God is not great. This whole book, we've seen all of its gas, all of its diversions, all of its digressions, all of its inaccuracies. This whole book, I think, should have been crushed down into a 40-page and brilliant introduction to a new edition of The God That Failed. But it wasn't. That never happened. Instead, we have the book to deal with. And this chapter also deals with anti-Semitism, the virus of anti-Semitism. But the main thing, those are the two main things that I wanted to point out about the chapter. Number one is that it's Hitchens at his worst, playing incredible amounts of dirty pool by creating a version of religion in which he wins all arguments, in which the obvious cases that anyone making a case against religion is going to have to deal with is someone saying, well, what about the non-religious regimes that killed so many millions of people? there are good responses to that, and Hitchens' response is not a good one. And unfortunately, almost all the new atheists that followed in his wake have just blindly repeated his response, which is nonsense. It's historical nonsense. But this chapter also has Hitchens at his best. The courageous Hitchens, the iconoclastic Hitchens, the Hitchens who wants people to think for themselves. Think for yourself. No groupthink. And that element of institutionalized religion is the thing that I think animates his hatred of it just in general, just from start to finish. I think that's the animus behind this whole book. Not the offenses, not the hypocrisies, not anything like that. Just that it wants your soul as well as your body. So, in other words, a very meaty, very good chapter of a lot less in the way of rabbit chasing and digressions, a lot more focused, because I believe in this chapter we're dealing with things that Hitchens really cared about. I think his main enemy in life was totalitarianism. And he just, whenever he digressed from that to animate against something else, he did it mainly for opportunism or money. But that brings us to the end of chapter 17, and we are now within spitting distance of the end of the book. So our next chapter tomorrow will be chapter 18, and that is A Finer Tradition, the resistance of the rational. And I will, David Murphy's video will probably be up later today. We are not conferring with each other, so I have no idea what he's going to say about this or any other chapter. But I'll be watching with interest, and then tomorrow we'll move on to the penultimate chapter in the book. So I'll wrap this up for now, and we'll see each other then. Thank you, Book 2.